Hello and welcome to Still Behind the Bench. My name is Adam, and on this channel I will attempt to describe the science behind distilling spirits in a more technical way. Hopefully it'll whet your appetite to learn more and teach you enough so that you're more self-sufficient. So for this video, I'm going to be talking about developing a recipe. It will most likely be split into multiple videos simply because there is so much content to get through, but I will try to keep the videos short as possible, and I will try to keep the number of videos limited. Let's get started. Okay, so there are essentially 4 major steps in developing a recipe. Determine which spirit and what ingredients are required. Figure out what the ABV of the wash will be and how much are we making. Determine how much of each ingredient is needed, and then how much water will be needed and at what temperatures will that water be needed. So we'll just jump right into step 1. Which spirit am I going to make and what ingredients are needed? I have included links to various legal definitions for different regions: the US, European Union, Canada, and Australia. The US document is by far the superior document. It is quite detailed and very well laid out. It comes from a free guidebook created by the U.S. Treasury Department called the Beverage Alcohol Manual. I've also linked to that in the description. I will be referencing this document for descriptions for different spirits for this video and probably future videos. It's so well done. So for this series of videos, I'm going to be doing 4 different spirits. I'm going to start with a all-grain malt whiskey. I'm going to do a sugar wash vodka, a fruit brandy, and then a rum. This will generally cover most types of feedstocks you'll be dealing with. I'm not sure how many videos it will take, probably 3, but we'll see how things work. None of these are going to be what's called a sugar head. That's when you add sugar as an adjunct to increase the ABV of the final spirit that you make. But when it does come to sugar heads, I do have some rules that I go by. For all grain spirits, I say use a malt extract before you go straight to using a sugar. You'll get much better flavor out of using a malt extract than you will a straight sugar. Also, if your sugar somehow needs to be more than 30% of the total ingredients, I say make the grain spirit separately without the sugar, then make a neutral spirit separately with the sugar, and use that to fortify the grain spirit. You'll have less of a chance of creating a high gravity wort that will stress out the yeast and produce off flavors, and you'll also have a supply of high proof ethanol that you can use to fortify any other spirit you make or use for anything else you need to use it for. It is a little bit more work, but in the end you have a superior product. So let's take a look at this chapter 4 from the Beverage Alcohol Manual. It's pretty simple. It lists the general class, gives a general definition of that class, then the different types of alcohol within that class, and then a general definition. We're doing a malt whiskey, and the general type definition states whiskey produced at not exceeding 80% alcohol by volume, or 160 proof, from a fermented mash of not less than 51% malted barley, and stored at not more than 62.5% alcohol by volume, or 125 proof, in charred new oak containers. So, in terms of developing a recipe, the only pertinent piece of information here is that the mash needs to be at least 51% malted barley. So that is what we are going to do. So we know our main ingredient has to be at least 51% malted barley. I'm going to use two types of grains. One of them is going to be a malted barley, a base malted barley. It's going to be 60%. And then I'm going to just use 40% for the other grain. So let's get to the next step. Okay, so we know that the malt whiskey needs to be at least 51% malted barley. I'm just going to go with a simple 60-40 split between the base malt and what our adjunct is going to be. The next step is to figure out what you want the ABV of your wash to be and how much you're going to be making. I typically just go with 10% ABV wash. Really, you can choose any number you want. Professional distilleries for whiskeys typically only go up to about 8%. But yeah, I use 10% ABV wash, which means the specific gravity or the original gravity of the wash should be as close to 1.075 as possible. This gives you a high enough return on investment in terms of how much money and time you put into it versus how much alcohol you'll get out of it, while also not being super stressful on the yeast, which we know produces off flavors. So for these examples, I will also be producing 50 liters of wash, which is 13 gallons. Now we can choose specifically what grains we want. I'm going to be using Bryce products just because their spec sheets were easy to find and they have all the pertinent information. So the base malt's going to be Odyssey whiskey malt, and then the adjunct is going to be white wheat malt. So when you buy your grains, you should get a spec sheet like this. It's an analysis of the grains for that lot or batch. These are just examples that they have, or general or averages of what these products typically have. There are 3 values you need to know from the spec sheet: the moisture content, the extract value, and the diastatic power. So you can see on this sheet it states extract FG dry basis 84%. Extract value will typically be listed as one of 2 values, or 1 of 2 units, either a percentage or what's liter degrees per kilogram. This is typically found in Europe. Percent seems to be found pretty much everywhere else. Depends on which standards they follow. I almost always see percent, and only once or twice has it come up as liter degrees per kilogram, and I just convert to percent, which I'll show you how to do in a bit. So extract FG dry basis. What does this mean? The extract value will be listed as FG, which means fine grind, or it will be listed as CG, coarse grind. Fine grind can also be listed as 0.2 millimeter, which is typically the average size of the ground grain. And then coarse will be sometimes also listed as 0.7 millimeter or 7 m. Now, fine grind is the ideal amount of extract you can get out of any grain. And when we're talking about extract, we mean the amount of soluble starches you can get out of that grain. When they do a fine grind, it's almost like a flour consistency, and they will mash for extremely long times that we would consider impractical or a waste of time. They want to know the maximum amount. So the number isn't realistic, I guess I should say, for hobbyists or even professional distillers. The more realistic number will be coarse grind, but that's not always listed. Like on this spec sheet, it says extract FG, and it gives us the difference between the fine grind and the coarse grind, less than 2%, but it does not list coarse grind. Sometimes they won't. They will almost always list fine grind though. So with this Odyssey whiskey malt, the extract fine grind is 84%. They say the difference is less than 2%, but I'm just going to assume that the extract value is 82%. That way the extract typically be a little bit higher, but hopefully it won't be lower than 82%. Okay, so the next thing you may see on these spec sheets is where it says DB or dry basis. What this means is they're listing it as if there is no moisture inside that grain. There obviously is going to be moisture. They list the moisture, 4%, but this makes it easier for them to compare between lots and batches. Makes it easier for us to compare between lots and batches as well. So if it lists dry basis, you can use that value the way it is. However, sometimes it may state AI or as is. What this means is they are counting in the moisture. So when you do the calculations, which I'm about to show you, you will need to take that moisture content into account and subtract it from the extract value before you continue on with the calculation. Okay, so here's our first bit of math. We have our 82% extract value. 82% extract value. This is if you have the, remember I said the as is value, you have to remember to subtract the moisture content from the extract value before you continue. And then up here is US freedom units, and then down here is metric. Now you may be wondering, what is the 46.21 and what is the 384? Well, all grains are compared to sucrose, the sugar, and that is the reference value. So 46.21 is the number of gravity points you get if you put 1 pound of sucrose in 1 gallon of water. And 384 is the number of gravity points you get if you put 1 kilogram of sucrose in 1 liter of water. So this is just showing you the ideal amount of extract you would get if you got exactly 82%. So before we go on to the next step, I just wanted to quickly show how you convert between percentage and liter degrees per kilogram. So let's just say you have a spec sheet that says you have 300 liter, got that backwards there, liter degrees per kilogram, and you want to convert it into percent. You just divide that by 3.86 and you get something like 77.27. And then to do the opposite, you would do 77.27 times 3.86 and you'd get 300. It's probably actually like 299.999 whatever, but close enough. So yeah, that's how you switch between the two. I almost always do that because I prefer working with the percentage than working with this large unit behemoth. So next we're gonna get into what is called mashing efficiency or brewhouse efficiency, because these values here are the ideal, and as we know in the real world you'll never get these ideal numbers. Mashing efficiency or brewhouse efficiency is how efficient your mashing process is at extracting up to this amount of starches. Okay, so here we have our formula or our equations including the mash efficiency. So I always start off at 70% mash efficiency or mashing efficiency or brewhouse efficiency, because that is typically, you probably won't get a whole lot higher than that. You might. Generally speaking, when you start out, this is about as high as you'll likely get. Once you get through a few more mashes, you'll generally know what your actual mash efficiency is going to be, and you may be able to figure out some other ways to boost it up, especially if you get into milling your own grains, because you can mill them finer. But 70% is a good place to start. So as we see, we have our 82% extract value, our references, the sucrose reference for both freedom units and metric, and then we get final values of 26.52 gravity points per pound of grain in per gallon of water, and then 220.42 gravity points per kilogram of grain per liter of water. But that doesn't really tell us how much grain we actually need, and that's where the next set of formulas come into. So if we have 13 gallons of water and our extract value is 26.52 gravity points per pound per gallon, how much grain do we need? We know, you can see over here, the base malt is going to be 60%. So 60% of 75 gravity points is 45 gravity points. That means we need to know how much grain, what mass of grain is equal to 45 gravity points when it's in this volume of water. In freedom units, it turns out to be 22.06 pounds, and in metric, it's 10.21 kilogram. That'll give us the 45 gravity points that we need. Then you can just repeat this for the other grains that you're going to use. In this case, we're using the white wheat malt. It has an extract CG value, dry basis, of 84%. So you switch this to 84, you do your calculations again, and then the next values are going to be, I believe, 11.77 pounds and 6.64 kilograms of the white wheat to get the 30 gravity points that we need. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is figure out the diastatic power of these grains. We already have our original gravity, so we need to know if the amount of grains we're using will have more than enough diastatic power to convert itself, and the other grain, if the other grain also doesn't have enough diastatic power. So the Odyssey whiskey malt that we're using has a diastatic power of 100 degrees Lintner, and the white wheat malt has a diastatic power of 160 degrees Lintner. So automatically we know from the diastatic power video that there's more than enough diastatic power for these grains to convert themselves, but we'll do the math anyways. What you do is you take the mass of the grain you're using, multiply it by the diastatic power of that grain, and you'll get this value. It will be kilograms per degree Lintner. So you do that for each grain, then you sum those values, and with the answer of that, you divide it by the total mass of the grains, and that will give you the combined diastatic power in degrees Lintner. In this case, it's 123.64 when done in metric, and it's 120.87 degrees Lintner when done in freedom units. I imagine somewhere when I was doing this, I just cut off too many decimal points, but they're close enough. And we see from the total that it's well above the 30 to 35 degrees Lintner required as the minimum for diastatic power for a grain to be able to convert itself. So now we know for sure how much grain to add to get the specific gravity we need, and that it will have enough diastatic power to convert itself. So technically speaking, from this point, you could start mashing. Especially if you're doing smaller volumes, you don't really need to calculate out all the water values and the temperature values. Still going to show you how to do them, but at this point you could just go and start making your mashes. But let's get to the how much water to add and at what temperatures. Okay, before I get into how much water you need to add and the temperature of that water, I wanted to talk a bit about what a property called bulk density. This is essentially mass per volume for generally any product. It's used a lot in individualized products like grains, sugars, any sort of powders. So you know how much, so you know what size volume equals what weight. So for ground barley, 1 cubic foot is 25 pounds and 1 cubic meter is 400 kilograms. For cracked wheat, 1 cubic foot is 35 pounds and 1 cubic meter is 561 kilograms. So right there we know that the cracked wheat packs more densely than the ground barley. But the reason we want to know about this is so that we know when we initially add grain to the water or add water to the grain, how much displacement is that barley going to have or wheat going to have on the water. Will our vessel be big enough to hold both the water and the barley and the grains when we initially mix them together? So I just did some quick calculations. In metric, we have our 10.21 kilograms of Odyssey malt, and we have 6.64 of the white wheat. Here is the liter per kilogram values of their bulk density. So together or individually, the Odyssey malt is 25.5 liters and the white wheat is 6.9 liters. So together, total 32.38 liters of displacement for the white wheat and the Odyssey malt. And then in freedom units, 22.06 pounds and 11.77 pounds. Bulk density, we get 6.6 gallons and 2.52 gallons for a total of 9.2 gallons of displacement. So if we're doing 50 liters or 13 gallons, right off the bat we know that we need at least 83 liters just for it to not overflow when we first mix them together. The volume will shrink as the water seeps into the grains, but if you're going to be doing a 50 liter wash, you'll probably want a 100 liter vessel if you're going to be aiming for a 10% ABV with these grains. And the same goes for in freedom units. We have 13 gallons. So right off the bat, we need a 23-gallon vessel. I would just go up to 30 gallons just to be safe. Yeah, this just goes to show you there is quite a bit of displacement when you're adding these grains to the water, or adding the water to the grains. You can just quickly do this and figure out whether or not your vessel is going to be big enough. I've listed a bunch of bulk density charts down in the description. I'll put a copy of this. I just copied the values off of one of them, and then I added the gallons per pound and the liters per kilogram myself. You'll have to try and determine which one closely or matches yours the closest, but it's pretty handy to do if this is the first time you're going to be doing an all grain mash, or you're changing the volumes with which and masses with which you're dealing with. Okay, so the first water related topic I want to talk about is mash consistency, and that's just how thick or thin the mash is. So is it easy to stir or is it hard to stir? Does it look like the enzymes can easily mix around inside the mash or not? If you're going to be dealing with something high in beta glucans like a rye or an oats, you may want to make your mash a little bit thinner. But if you're not, then you could probably sit it in the middle or even make it a bit thicker just to save water. So the rule of thumb is in metric 2.6 liters per kilogram to 3.1 liters per kilogram. And then in freedom units, it's 1.25 quarts per pound to 1.50 quarts per pound. So with our mash, that would mean between 44 liters to 52 liters of water, or 42 quarts to 51 quarts of water. Since we're using about 40% wheat, I might try to lean towards the thin side since we're on a sort of a threshold. Wheat can get thick once you get above about 40% wheat. So I might, if I was doing this, I might go somewhere around, I'd probably just go with 3 liters per kilogram just because the math is a lot easier. Okay, water absorption. This is what happens when you're done mashing and you're taking the grains out. Those grains have absorbed water. Typically, it will range between 0.835 liters per kilogram to 1.67 liters per kilogram, or 0.1 gallon per pound to 0.2 gallons per pound. Not always, sometimes it's less, sometimes it can be more. Generally speaking, I find that it's typically broken down into 3 different ranges. So if you're using something like a grist or something finely ground, a flour, the finer the grind, the less water it will hold. Typically, it will range between 0.835 liters per kilogram to only 1 liter per kilogram, or 0.1 gallons per pound to 0.12 gallons per pound. Then the next level, if you have less than 20% rye or oats, less than or equal to about 40% wheat, and then pretty much any other grain, you'll at most lose between 1 liter per kilogram to 1.25 liters per kilogram, or 0.12 gallons per pound to 0.15 gallons per pound. If you're using more than 20% rye and oats, more than 40% wheat, then it can be as high as 1.25 liters per kilogram to 1.67 liters per kilogram, or 0.15 gallons per pound to 0.2 gallons per pound. And these are generally just maximums. So I do the calculation and then I have that much water sitting on the side, maybe just a little bit more than that, sitting on the side, ready to go so I can dump it in and then get ready to take the next step. So with the mash we've been calculating here, 16.85 kilograms, you could lose, that should be volume, not mass, upwards of 21 liters of water. And in freedom units, 33.83 pounds, you could lose upwards of 5.1 gallons of water when you pull the grains out. Next, we will get into strike water temperature. Okay, so here we are, strike water temperature. May seem a little daunting, but it's really not that bad. This first equation, you won't be using it, but this is the natural way the equation looks. Essentially, it's taking certain mass of water with a certain specific heat and a certain temperature, and then you're adding a bunch of other components to it. Say you're adding sugar and you're adding sand and you're adding salt and whatever and ever. when you mix them all together, what is your final temperature going to be? Now, we already know what our final temperature is going to be. You know, if we're doing a mash that has lots of rye or lots of oats, we're going to want to break down those beta glucans that increase the viscosity. So we're going to do what's called a beta glucan rest, which happens at 45 degrees Celsius or 113 degrees Fahrenheit. So that would be our TF value. If we're just going to jump straight into beta amylase and glucoamylase, you could jump to 55 degrees Celsius, which is 131 degrees Fahrenheit. Or you could go a little bit higher, depending on what enzymes you're going to use. If you're going to be using exogenous enzymes or you purchased enzymes, typically they come from a bacteria and they may be able to handle higher temperatures, so you can have a much higher final temperature to make your mashing go quicker. But generally speaking, you want to use the lowest temperature enzyme as your target temperature. So I've written them all out and I'll go through it step by step, explaining what each value is. And so yeah, let's get started. So I'm aiming for a starting temperature of 55 degrees Celsius or 131 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is going to be my first mashing temperature. I have how much water, the mass of the water, 50 kilograms. So 50 liters of water is 50 kilograms. 13 gallons is roughly 108.4 pounds. Then we have the specific heat of water. So specific heat is how much energy does it take to raise a certain mass of water by a certain temperature. In this case, it takes 4.186 kilojoules of heat energy to raise 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Or it takes 1 BTU to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. Then we have the mass of the grains, 16.85 kilograms and 33.83 pounds. And I'm combining all the grains into essentially treating it as one grain. And that's because the specific heat of grains, and I went through a whole lot of them, a bunch of other people have gone through a lot of them, and they all seem to be so close that generally speaking, people use values between 1.63 and 1.59 kilojoules per kilogram degrees Celsius. So I just use 1.59 kilojoules per kilogram degrees Celsius for the specific heat of the grains. And that's 0.3798 BTU per pound degree Fahrenheit. So remember, that means it takes that many BTUs to raise that many pounds, or to raise 1 pound of that grain by 1 degree Fahrenheit, or 1 kilogram of that grain by 1 degree Celsius. And I'll put this in the description. I'll put this in the description as well. I'll put both these formulas as well as the formulas without numbers, just the variables instead. So to continue, then we have the mass of the grains. We have the temperature of the grains. In this case, I just chose what my room temperature currently is, 24 degrees Celsius, which is 75.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Then we have the specific heat of the grains again, over top of the mass and specific heat of the water. So if we have 50 kilograms of water and we add 16.85 kilograms of grain, and that grain is at 24 degrees Celsius, what temperature does the water need to be for it to drop down to 55 degrees Celsius after we've added those grains? Turns out that is 58.97 degrees Celsius. So 50 kilograms of water at 58.97 degrees Celsius. We add 16.85 kilograms of grain at 24 degrees Celsius, and it should drop down to 55 degrees Celsius. Then the same for freedom units. If we have 13 gallons or 108.4 pounds of water, and we add 33.83 pounds of grain sitting at 75.2 degrees Fahrenheit, how hot does the water need to be in order to only drop down to 131 degrees Fahrenheit? It is 137.61 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, realistically, this water is going to be sitting in some sort of vessel and it's going to be giving off heat. So the numbers might actually be, your end number, 131 degrees Fahrenheit or 55 degrees Celsius, might actually be a bit lower. So you may want to, instead of putting it at 55, maybe 57. And the same goes for Fahrenheit, maybe go 133, 134 as your target temperatures. And then by the time you get everything mixed and everything is settled and there's been enough time for heat energy to pass between the water and the grains, you should get really close to these final temperatures. So after you've done this part of your mashing, so you've heated your water, you've added your grains, you've done the mashing, saccharification, gelatinization, liquefaction, saccharification. Then you'll pull your grains out, you'll let them drain, or you'll sparge, or however you decide to lauter. You've already calculated what your water absorption value should be, or the maximum water absorption should be. Typically it'll be lower than that, but I always have that amount of water set to the side. In this case it was like 20 liters or 5 gallons, roughly speaking. I usually have that water at this temperature or higher, because if I'm doing grains, I like to do a pre-fermentation boil, as it's called, or a sterilization. I don't technically go to boiling temperatures. I will hit a minimum of 71 degrees Celsius, which is 160 degrees Fahrenheit. If you can hold this for a minimum of 5 minutes, you should kill any bacteria or fungus that are sitting on those grains that hitched a ride. That is if you want to kill them off. You don't necessarily have to, because when you pitch your yeast, you're going to be pitching far more individual microbes with your yeast than any concentration of hitchhikers there will be on those grains. So it's not always necessary. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't. I can be lazy sometimes. But yes, I will typically add that extra water as boiling water, because the grains are gone, the enzymes have done their job, there's no risk. But you'll never get up to this temperature, just saying, by adding that water. You will need to find a way, if you're going to do a pre-fermentation boil, if you're going to go to boiling point, or if you're just going to heat it up to this temperature, you'll have to find another way to heat up that water. And that's it for this all grain portion of this series of videos. The next videos I'm going to be doing will be on the sugar wash vodka and the fruit brandy. I think I'm going to do apricots, just because I like apricot brandy. And hopefully I'll have that video out in the next few days. Hope you learned something. If you want to see more videos like this, please click like and subscribe, and have a great week.